San Diego, California, the spring of 1953. A Tuesday afternoon in a diner on Broadway, 4 blocks from the Santa Fe Depot, in the kind of establishment that existed in every American port city in that era. A long counter along one wall, a row of booths along the other, a kitchen visible through a pass-through window, a cash register at the front that had been there since the building opened and would be there long after the current owners moved on. The lunch rush had ended an hour earlier, and the diner had settled into the specific mid-afternoon quiet that diners settle into between the last of the lunch customers and the first of the early dinner ones. The quiet of a room that has been full of people and noise and is now returning to itself. The coffee still warm on the burner. The pie case with 2 slices missing from the apple and 1 from the cherry. The counter wiped down and waiting for whoever came through the door next. The counter had 3 customers. The booths had 2. The light came through plate glass windows that faced the street. The flat, bright light of a San Diego afternoon in April that made everything in the diner look more real than it needed to look. Every coffee cup and paper napkin and chrome napkin holder rendered in the specific clarity of midday California sun. The woman behind the counter was named Dorothy. She had been working the lunch shift at this diner for 11 years and had, in those 11 years, developed the specific quality of attention that long-service counter workers develop, which was the ability to hear every conversation in the room simultaneously without appearing to listen to any of them. She heard the 2 men in the corner booth before she saw them clearly. She heard them because their voices had the specific edge that voices acquire when 2 people who are trying not to argue in public are losing the effort to keep the argument contained to the register it started in. She looked at the corner booth. 2 men in United States Marine Corps dress uniforms, both young enough that the uniforms still looked slightly too formal for the bodies wearing them, the way dress uniforms look on men who have earned them recently and have not yet worn them enough times that the formality becomes invisible. Both with the ribbons that said Korea on their chests, the specific arrangement of colored cloth that told anyone who knew how to read it where they had been and what they had done and what it had cost them to do it. The ribbons were not decorations in the way that the word decoration implies performance. They were a record. A compressed and color-coded record of specific events in specific places that the men wearing them carried on their chests in the specific way that serious things are carried, which is without calling attention to them. Both young, one with a corporal's chevrons on his sleeve and the other with a private first-class stripe. Both with the specific posture that the Marine Corps produces in the men it trains, shoulders back and spine straight, even in a diner booth, even in the middle of an argument, even when what was being argued about was causing the kind of distress that posture is supposed to conceal. She could not hear the specific words yet. She could hear the tone of 2 men who had come in together and ordered together and eaten together, and were now looking at a check that was producing between them a conversation neither of them had wanted to have. She had learned, in 11 years behind this counter, to read the specific acoustics of that conversation, the lowered voices, the pauses that were longer than the words they surrounded, the way one man's voice would go quiet and the others would follow, neither of them wanting to be the one speaking when the thing that needed to be said was said. She had heard it before in this diner, and in the diner before this one, where she had worked for 3 years before coming to San Diego. It was not a conversation about money in the way that conversations about money are usually understood. It was a conversation about the specific gap between what two men had expected of an afternoon when they walked into a diner together and what the afternoon had turned out to contain. The check was for $2.35. Dorothy knew this because she had written it. 2 blue plate specials, 2 coffees, 1 slice of pie. $2.35 was not a large amount of money in the ordinary sense. In the specific sense of 2 Marines on active duty pay in 1953, it was the kind of amount that could produce the conversation she was watching if the timing was wrong, if the pay period was ending rather than beginning, if one of the 2 men had obligations that the other did not know about or had forgotten when they sat down. She had seen this conversation before, not often, enough times to recognize it. She was considering whether to do the thing she sometimes did in these situations, which was to find a reason to reduce the check, a phantom discount, a miscalculation in the diner's favor that she would quietly correct. When the door of the diner opened and a man came in from the street. She had done it before for men in uniform when the timing was wrong and the amount was the wrong size for the pay period. She had done it without anyone asking and without anyone knowing, because the point of doing it that way was that it required nothing from the person receiving it except the ability to accept it without understanding it as charity. He was not in uniform. He wore a plain gray sport coat over a dark shirt and dark trousers, and he was 6 feet 4 inches tall and moved through the door with the specific economy of a large man who has spent a long time learning to move in spaces designed for smaller ones. He was 45 years old. He had a face that the previous decade had put in movie theaters across the country, a face that Dorothy recognized the moment she saw it clearly. Though she did not say anything and did not change her expression, because she had lived in San Diego long enough to understand that the correct response to recognizing someone in a diner was to treat them like anyone else who had walked through the door. He sat down at the counter, 3 stools from the nearest customer. He picked up the menu. He set it back down. He looked at the coffee pot on the burner behind the counter. Dorothy poured him a cup without being asked. He nodded. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it, and appeared to be a man who had somewhere to be in a little while, and was using this cup of coffee as the interval between where he had been and where he was going. John Wayne was 45 years old in April 1953, and had been making films since 1928, and had, in the 25 years between those 2 points, developed a specific understanding of what his work was for, and what it was not for, and what the difference between those 2 things required of him in the hours when he was not working. He was in San Diego because he had been filming location footage for a production that had brought him south from Los Angeles for 3 days. He had wrapped the morning's work at noon and had 2 hours before the car came to take him back to the hotel. The production assistant had offered to arrange lunch somewhere nearby, somewhere with a private room and a menu that the studio would cover. He had said no thank you. He had said it in the specific way he said things he meant, which was without elaboration or explanation. And the production assistant had nodded and written something in his clipboard and moved on. And John Wayne had walked out of the location and turned south on Broadway and walked until he found the diner. He had walked from the production location to this diner because walking was what he did. When he had time he had not planned for and did not want to spend in a hotel room or a production trailer. He walked, and he found places that served coffee, and he sat in them for as long as the coffee lasted and watched the particular life of wherever he happened to be. It was not a method he had developed consciously. It was something he had always done. From the years before the films, when he had been a nobody in Los Angeles, trying to understand what kind of man he was. Through the years, when the films had made him into something he had not quite anticipated being. And into the present, when he was 45 years old and had been in more movies than he could count from memory, and still needed, occasionally, to sit in a diner in an unfamiliar city and watch the afternoon move through a plate glass window to remember what ordinary life looked like from the inside. San Diego in April 1953 was a city that had a specific relationship with the military that showed itself in 100 small ways, if you were paying the kind of attention he was paying. The uniforms on the street, the particular way that men in their early 20s carried themselves when they had been through something that had reorganized their understanding of what their bodies were for. The conversations that happened in diners between men who had been to Korea and were now back, and were discovering that the world they had returned to had continued without them in ways both larger and smaller than they had anticipated. He was paying that kind of attention because he had spent the previous decade making films about men like the ones he was watching. And the difference between making those films well and making them adequately was the difference between paying attention and not. He heard the two men in the corner booth the same way Dorothy had heard them, which was with the peripheral attention of someone who is not trying to overhear, but whose hearing has been trained by years of sitting in public places and paying attention to register the specific frequencies of human distress before the conscious mind has decided to listen. The edge in the voices. The specific register of an argument that both parties wish they were not having. He did not look at them directly. He drank his coffee and looked at the street through the plate glass window, and listened in the specific way he listened to things that were worth listening to, which was completely. He heard enough to understand what the argument was about. He heard the amount. He heard the corporal say that he had not realized, and the private say that it was all right in the tone that means it is not all right. He heard the silence that followed, the silence of two men sitting with a check and a problem, and no good solution to it that did not cost one of them something he did not want to spend. He set his coffee cup down on the counter. He did not turn around to look at the booth. He did not call over to the two men. He did not perform any of the gestures that a man performs when he wants the room to understand that he is about to do something generous. He looked at Dorothy. He said one thing. He said that he would take care of the check for the two gentlemen in the corner booth when they were ready. He said it in a voice low enough that the two men in the corner booth did not hear it. He said it in the flat, informational tone of a man relaying a logistical detail rather than making an announcement. Dorothy looked at him. She said that she would handle it. He nodded. He turned back to the window. He drank the rest of his coffee. He set the cup down. He put $3 on the counter, which covered his coffee and a tip that was larger than the coffee required. He stood. He put on his sport coat. He walked to the door. He went through it without looking at the corner booth. The door closed. Dorothy waited until she heard the corporal call for the check. She walked to the corner booth. She told them the check had been taken care of. The corporal said that there must be a mistake. She said there was no mistake. The private asked who had paid it. She said a gentleman at the counter who had already left. The corporal looked at the counter, which had one empty coffee cup and $3 on it, and nothing else. He looked at the door. He looked back at Dorothy. He said that he did not understand. She said that there was nothing to understand. She said that someone had wanted to buy them lunch and had done it and had left, and that the rest of it was just details. The two men sat in the corner booth for a moment. Then the corporal picked up his cover from the seat beside him and put it on. The private did the same. They stood. They walked to the door. They went through it onto Broadway. The afternoon was still going in the ordinary way that San Diego afternoons went in April. The street traffic and the light and the particular smell of a city 2 miles from the ocean carrying on with the specific indifference of cities to the small private moments that happen inside the buildings along their streets. The corporal stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He was 23 years old and had been in the Marine Corps for 4 years and had been to Korea and back and had learned in those 4 years the specific discipline of not showing on his face things that were happening inside him that were not the business of whoever was standing in front of him. What was happening inside him at this particular moment on the sidewalk on Broadway in San Diego on a Tuesday afternoon in April was something that the discipline was working to contain, with the specific effort that containment requires when the thing being contained is not grief or fear, but the simpler, and in some ways, harder thing, which is unexpected kindness from a stranger. He looked in both directions along Broadway. There were people on the sidewalk in both directions. None of them were 6 feet 4 inches tall in a gray sport coat. Dorothy watched them through the plate glass window. She watched the corporal look at the street and not find what he was looking for, and then square his shoulders and say something to the private, and the two of them walked south toward the depot. She went back to the counter. She picked up the $3 and the empty coffee cup. She had been working this counter for 11 years and had seen the full range of what people did in diners, the full range of how people treated each other in the small transactions that diners made possible. She had seen people walk out without paying. She had seen people argue about checks that were correct. She had seen people leave pennies as tips for women who had served them attentively for 45 minutes. She had also seen people do the thing that had just happened, and in 11 years it had not happened often enough that she had stopped noticing it when it did. She had seen it done by people who wanted to be seen doing it, and by people who did not. She had learned to tell the difference in the first moment, in the way the person giving the instruction phrased it, and the volume at which they phrased it, and whether their eyes moved toward the people they were helping or stayed where they had been before they decided to help. The man at the counter had not moved his eyes. He had looked at her and stated a logistical fact and turned back to the window. She had worked the counter long enough to know what that meant. She rinsed the coffee cup carefully. She put the $3 in the register. She went back to work. Outside on Broadway, the afternoon continued. In the corner booth where 2 Marines had sat, the check was paid, and the plates were cleared, and the booth was empty. And in 20 minutes, someone else would sit down in it and order lunch, and the diner would go on in the way that diners go on. The same counter and the same booths and the same light through the same plate glass window, holding the ordinary afternoon in the ordinary way, which is without memory of anything specific that happened in it, and without any record of who passed through,